how do you actually create evidence for a digital technology, for software as a medical device? And it's not appropriate always to go and do, we talk about randomized controlled trials as a gold standard of evidence. You can't really do a randomized controlled trial for every single technology.
Hello and welcome to Clinical Changemakers. Today on the show we have Dr. Saira Ghafur. She is a medical doctor who specialises in respiratory medicine. She is also an academic and expert in digital health at Imperial College London and is a co-founder of two startups, including Prova Health, where she is the Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Saira Ghafur, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, we were just speaking about something that has got your attention, is very exciting. That is in the space of cybersecurity. Now, I don't have a lot of knowledge in that space other than, don't click on funny links that get sent to you and that kind of basic stuff. So what is it about the cybersecurity space, particularly in healthcare, that's caught your attention?
So we've been working on this at Imperial over the past couple of years. So the whole cybersecurity in healthcare space is actually not very much going on from a research perspective. And we've got to look at cybersecurity. It's very different in healthcare compared to other critical sectors. You and I are both doctors. If you can't look into an electronic health record, you can't get someone's scans up, blood tests, etc., you're delaying patient care. And inevitably, if you think of this across the board for a whole hospital, multiple hospitals, multiple GP surgeries, if you can't do that for, days on end because of a cyber attack, that is going to significantly impact patient care. And there's so many other ways that, there's essentially going to be patient harm as a result of a cyber attack. And that could be a cyber attack or some kind of IT failure. But actually, how do we become a resilient healthcare system in the face of, the fact that we're using so many more digital products, or most of the health services that we use are somewhat digitized at some part. And if there's a failure or a cyber attack in any part of that system, how do we make sure that we're still able to deliver safe patient care, but also making sure that we're a resilient system in the face of any type of cyber attack?
Yeah, and I'd just like to pick up on the idea of cyber attacks. I mean, in the news, in the media, in both our countries, these sorts of things have been topical, and they've really brought some health systems to their knees in terms of their ability to deliver care, because we are so reliant on our digital technologies now. I wondered, did you have any perspective on how this a threat is grown or changed over maybe the last decade or so? Is it more sophisticated? Are we getting a lot more attacks? What does it look like?
Oh, it's hugely increased. And I think part of the reason is we're so much more reliant on digital. But say pre-pandemic, cyber attacks in healthcare were probably less than other critical sectors, such as like finance, energy, nuclear, etc. And the kind of purpose of a cyber attack probably at that point was you could steal medical records or hack into medical records, sell them in the dark web, and you can extract money for that. And that was probably more so in the US than anywhere else. And it was probably a couple of bad actors doing it in not a very kind of sophisticated way. Fast forward a couple of years, and this is a statistic from the US that cyber attacks have grown fivefold. And now they are much more sophisticated, somewhat state-sponsored, and really quite egregious. And the number of cyber attacks happening in quite a significant way has massively increased, taking down health systems, huge swathes of health data being lost or stolen, and actually the disruption that it causes. And I think the difference is that bad actors kind of realize the impact you can have on a health service is actually quite phenomenal, that chaos that it creates compared to, say, other sectors. And you can't really shut down a healthcare system. You've still got to provide care. People are still trying to use various different records, etc. So you can't really shut anything down. Whereas, for example, in banking, you could shut down access to different systems. You can't do that in healthcare. But just even the thought of cyber attacks in healthcare, that headline, but then the fear, the chaos, and the disruption it causes in any given situation is huge.
Yeah, I mean, heart attacks don't stop because the system is down, and all those essential surgeries and yeah, I can really picture that. just maybe a little bit of a silly question. I mean, I can understand where the bad actors perhaps motivations for just to do something bad, but what is the actual value of a medical record to somebody other than a person? Like, why would somebody pay for that?
Depends on where you are. So, like in the UK, I mean, I'm not sure a medical record on its own is going to be, that useful. In the US, because it's linked to employer data or, it's linked to your job data, etc., personal details in there as well. So, actually creating new identities based or creating identities based on stolen information there. And that's the kind of stuff that you can do as a result of like stealing people's personal data. You can open up a new credit card, you can do X or Y, so lots of different things like that. So somewhere like probably New Zealand and the UK, not that useful. In the US, probably much more useful. But again, it's back to chaos and disruption, and that's what I think some of these hackers and attackers are looking at. But also, if it's a ransomware attack, then actually, again, in the UK, we've had a recent cyber attack. As a public institution, you don't pay out ransomware, but in certain states in the US, and especially if you're one of the major providers in the US, if you're like the Mayo Clinic or Cedar Sinai, etc., you've had a cyber attack and you're in a state where you are allowed to pay ransom, then you will do that because actually reputational damage is huge. Your patients will walk to another provider, and literally it's that whole, you need to kind of shut that down as quickly as possible because it's from a business perspective, it's terrible. The patient safety perspective is going to happen anyway. So you need to stop that ASAP.
And so you spoke about resilience, because obviously, as you said, if your whole system is all tied together, then when the whole thing goes out, the whole thing goes out. So what does it mean for a health system to be more resilient?
So is it kind of what are your backup plans for like if all your IT goes down? You go back to pen and paper, but actually that's only somewhat safe for the next 36 hours or so. But actually, if you can access people's records, so if you're prescribing them anything, any drug interactions, allergies, or previous healthcare records to show past medical histories, etc., or significant events, so all of that. So in terms of like, what do you do if something goes down? Do you have backup systems? Where's your backup data? What else can you see? What have you got in terms of radiology services, pathology services? What happens to demand redistribution? So say, for example, your trauma centre is shut down. So live in London, the trauma centre in Northwest London shuts down because of a cyber attack. What happens to all of those patients that are relying on that service? Where do they go? What's the nearest hospital? How many patients can then they take up? Again, with pathology services, so it's all of that planning and thinking of like where people shift. So that piece as well. But also, if like everything in London shuts down, what happens then to like what's the next level of care? And also, in terms of that resilient health system, you need to make sure you're planning for more than one terrible event. So if you had a cyber attack and then a mass casualty event, what on earth are you going to do? What happens? So it's all of that resilience planning and thinking essentially the worst case scenarios and then working backwards.
And so the research that you've been doing, what is the kind of questions you've been asking and perhaps some of the things that you've been unearthing in this space?
So this is like a space where actually cybersecurity and other critical sectors is actually being fairly well done in terms of a research agenda. In healthcare, we're actually massively lagging behind. So we're already like hugely behind in terms of what we have as tools to help us improve cyber resilience in the sector, but also even understanding what happens research wise, what happens to patients in the public, to the healthcare system, resilience, etc. We don't really understand it. So without understanding the problem, it's very difficult to create lots of new solutions. And somewhat, we can use research from other sectors to fit into the healthcare space, but actually we are different compared to other sectors just for the volume of interactions, the interdependencies between systems. So if you think of like any type of interoperability, we don't even know what's interoperable within and between healthcare organizations, and then what happens to patients in the public in or as a result of any cyber attack. So we've been looking at the kind of safety incidences. We're working with the World Bank at the moment, looking at cyber resilience in low and middle income countries. Quite recently, we have developed a new framework for cybersecurity in healthcare, and we've been testing that in various different countries. And now we're hopefully looking at that demand redistribution piece with mathematical modelling to see what happens to patients in the public in the event of a cyber attack and how that impacts different services and what you do for planning as a result. So lots of different things going on.
Yeah, sounds really interesting and pretty exciting to be kind of at the forefront of that. But obviously, I guess still a little bit nerve wracking that it is such a novel space still.
So you kind of preach to the converted. It's quite funny. We've been talking about it for years. And then it happens, and it's that kind of cycle again. It's like then you get funding for the research, whereas before no one's really interested. We're like, why on earth is this interesting? Or I mean, it's not the super exciting, this is like this really cool piece of like tech or AI or whatever else. So it's kind of lower down in the agenda, but my God, the chaos and fear and the disruption as a result of a cyber attack is not great.
Absolutely. Now, some other work that you had started out, I believe, at Imperial was around this space of evidence generation and digital health technologies. And I think it's quite easy in medicine to think about medical devices, to think about pharmaceuticals and the traditional approaches to evidence generation there, whereas digital health technologies is a little bit maybe more opaque in how we assess these types of tools. And I wondered if we could touch on what that looks like, and also kind of what is a digital health technology? Is it an electronic health record? Is it an app that records your sleep? Is it all of the above, or some sort of inclusion or exclusion criteria there?
Definition wise, I think it's all of those across the board, and there's so many different definitions. If you look at every kind of a major multinational organization, they've got their own definition of digital health, but I think it's pretty much all of those in between. And earlier we were talking about software as a medical device, generally looking at that. I'd say that's the kind of area that we work in. As medics, we know about evidence generation or evidence-based practice in healthcare. So everything that you do has some kind of evidence base to it, and hopefully a very strong one. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing it. In digital health, it's an absolute, I mean, people always describe it as the Wild West. It really is the Wild West. And I think what we saw initially, that kind of, that digitization of healthcare services and technologies, it was quite a novel thing. That was kind of starting. How do you actually capture any evidence was not really a hugely thought about area. And then COVID happened, and then basically we had to digitize healthcare systems overnight to make sure that we were still retaining access. And then the market was almost like flooded with all these new tools and technologies that people were using, but actually no real evidence base behind them. So now we're in this space where we kind of need evidence. We actually massively need evidence. People don't know how to show the evidence, but actually it's becoming more and more important for many reasons. But that whole piece about how do you actually create evidence for a digital technology, for software as a medical device, and it's not appropriate always to go and do, we talk about randomized controlled trials. It's a gold standard of evidence. You can't really do a randomized controlled trial for every single technology used in healthcare, and it's not really appropriate to do so. For some, absolutely. For others, it's not the right thing to do. The time span is so long, the number of patients and the kind of design of the trial, etc., is not appropriate for that piece of technology. But you still need to be able to show evidence that you are able to deliver the stated outcomes. So that was that kind of, how do you do this in a very academic way at Imperial? And we did it. We worked with a large pharma company for one of the tools that they wanted to evaluate. Did the first trial, second, third, and then subsequently started up Prova Health, which is a startup that I run, and very much been kind of running in that space of evidence generation in digital health.
So I just wanted to pick up on that this space is so kind of underserved in terms of evidence generation. And I just wonder why that is. You've touched on the difficulty of doing the trials. But is there something in the regulation of these types of tools that perhaps we haven't kept up, or we haven't been able to scrutinize or hold to account these types of tools out in the wild?
Absolutely. So, medical devices, and if they're a certain class of medical device, there's very clear regulatory outputs that a company needs to be able to deliver. It's the grey area in between. So, in terms of software as a medical device that we use for many different apps, there's some rules and regulations there that you're meant to follow. And it goes across many different factors. So it's the evidence generation space, the regulation space, reimbursement, and how you actually adopt any of these tools. And without evidence for any of those, then it's a huge struggle for innovators to get anything out in the market that's useful. People are taking up, you're able to get reimbursed for it, and you're actually showing very good outcomes for patients in the public who are using them. And actually, as we all know, if you're not able to show good outcomes and if it's not enhancing somebody's life or making something better, then actually it's going to be defunct very, very soon. So one of the reasons is it's very difficult to do a trial. People don't know what trials to do and how to do them. And actually, you've got to look at the product life cycle as well. So it's not just a case of once you've got a legitimate product out in the market, that's when you do evidence. So you've got to do it right from that product lifestyle, from that early MVP. And depending on where you are in that product life cycle, the types of evidence that you should be collecting or gathering and the types of like studies that you should be doing are very, very different. So in that very early stage, it's probably very much more qualitative studies that you're doing, user-based research, interview studies, kind of doing that focus group type bit to see how you can improve that product at that part. The next stage would be actually collecting clinical outcomes. How are you, what is your endpoint targeted to be? What safety measures you need to be able to show? And then say the next stage, you're wanting out in the market. What economic evidence are you producing? What regulatory information do you need? What kind of trials do you need for those? And then say you've got something that's been out in the market for a while. What's the kind of type of real world evidence that you're gathering? How is that then informing further iterations of the product? So it's very much a product life cycle, and it's not a kind of static piece of we're collecting evidence at this piece and that's all we're doing. You've got to kind of think right across the board there.
And it sounds like, in throughout that product life cycle, there needs to be clinical and research advice given, working hand in glove with the technologists, because it sounds like, this is a space that is needing that evidence generation to prove the products are working, that they have value, that they're safe, kind of first and foremost. I think some of the products that many of us are probably thinking of in the digital health space might be considered neutral, i.e., they're a platform for consuming information and then inputting information. But the way that you interact with that tool could be positive or negative. You just don't know until you start doing some measurement. And I think that was really helpful to see how that type of research changes as the product matures, and probably helps to inform the product development, right? So this is working, this isn't working, these are our assumptions, and helps to kind of refine the product before it gets out onto the market. And therefore, it's going to be more valuable, it's going to solve people's needs, and also you're going to find those opportunities for people to pick up your product and to use it.
Absolutely. Very much across all of those things that you just mentioned there. And it's so important. And that's for like all people involved in it. So like as an innovator, you need to make sure you have all of that. As a payer and a provider, you need to make sure that you're kind of looking at that evidence before you're purchasing anything. And as a patient, or kind of member of the public who's using any of these technologies, you want to make sure that what you're using is going to enhance. But essentially, people think that the evidence is there before they actually do purchase any of these tools. So there's a huge gap in between there.
And from a regulatory standpoint, I can imagine that being quite difficult to find the right sort of levers to allow innovation to occur in the safe and appropriate ways, to allow the evidence to be created, because it's going to take some time and a bit of work. Then also having the right kinds of thresholds or gates or what have you, such that things that come out the other side are at the very least not harmful. What are the types of things that maybe regulators are already doing, or perhaps could be doing in the future to enhance this pipeline of innovation, firstly, and then second, high evidence generation?
Absolutely. So I think it's one of those things that, as you say, you don't want to stifle innovation, but we're almost kind of like building the plane as we're flying it to make sure we have that right type of regulation. So if you look at countries, Germany, you've got the DIGA system that you can have something on the market as long as they've got a certain criteria fulfilled. You can have it out in the market for their kind of directory in Germany, digital health tools that people can or clinicians can prescribe for patients, and then they've got a year to 18 months to develop that evidence base that then they can use for regulatory purposes. In France, through Pecan, they're doing a similar exercise for innovators to be able to bring their tools onto the market. In the UK, through NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, and NICE have basically developed the evidence standards framework, but also the early value assessment framework as well, for clinicians to be able to do something similar. And then the FDA. So I think they're all on a similar journey with different degrees of stringency in the regulation. But I think it's essentially being able to give innovators the chance to come onto the market with certain criteria fulfilled, but also allowing people to be able to develop the evidence while tools are out in the market, because it's that chicken and egg situation. It's, if you've got an innovation trying to work with a healthcare organization, they ask for, well, what evidence have you got that it works? But I can't provide evidence unless I show that, unless someone's using it. So you kind of go round and round until you find somewhere or someone to work with, to be able to do that. And then that's always that tricky bit, to be able to get some of that early evidence. And then you've got to think outside the box to see how else you can create that evidence.
And I can imagine as well, like all evidence generation in other fields too, is that clinically significant evidence. One is showing a difference and one is showing a difference that matters. And again, that would be another part to the story, which is building up that base, as you say. Something that I believe you've written about in the idea of clinical simulation and synthetic patients. I wondered if you could sort of elaborate on what that concept is and how that is part of this evidence generation space.
So just that last piece that I was saying is that you've got to sometimes think outside the box how to generate some of that evidence. So it's very much back to that early piece when you're looking to create evidence to show, a payer or a purchaser to show that this does have some evidence behind it, or you're trying to improve that early evidence generation base. So it's very difficult to, before you've got a kind of fully ready product, or you've been using it in some clinical situations, to do some of these trials. So we've used simulation. So we're all very used to simulation in a clinical setting. We've used it for exams, for training purposes, used hugely in surgical simulations. But we thought actually this would be quite cool to try simulation as a tool for generating evidence for digital tools. So it's basically creating that same kind of environment, testing a tool with the kind of same clinicians, having scenarios, but using that kind of synthetic patient data to create the different scenarios, having, whether it's test results, whether it's, pathology, radiology, patient backgrounds, and then testing the different scenarios with that digital health tool. And then depending on what type of product it is, what type of incumbent service that you're comparing it to. And that can generate results in a fairly kind of low risk, replicable way that you can carry out in different countries, in different time spans, and do that kind of comparator analysis there.
I want to pick up on that comment there about replication, because with these software tools, as they mature, the code is going to change, the features are going to change. And so how do you ensure that there is that consistency of what the evidence was created, at year one is maintained at year five? Does there have to be that kind of consistent thread? Is this something that would be like an audit that runs every year? What does it mean to kind of maintain the evidence base as the product changes over time?
Your tool in year one compared to your tool in year five may be vastly different. that early kind of prototype that you've iterated then in multiple times. And actually, there might be multiple other features that you add on to it as well. So, from a regulatory standpoint, and again, this is something that's still being grappled with, is do you need to do something completely different at year 5 when your tool has got, X, Y, and Z added onto it? But actually, this is where the really interesting bit of real world evidence comes in. So when that tool's out in the market, the brilliant thing is with digital health tools now is that you're using that data when something's out in the market, and you can look at unintended consequences. Is it, improving care? Is it causing patient harm, etc., etc.? And actually, where are people really benefiting from it? And then that's hopefully going to help you generate some of that evidence, but also help you improve that tool and essentially help you from that regulatory standpoint as well.
So, artificial intelligence is obviously the buzzword of the day at the moment, with large language models doing some pretty incredible things. Although their breakthrough into healthcare, in my opinion, hasn't quite happened just yet. I wondered, are there other things that had to be thought about with evidence generation for AI?
Some very similar things across the board, but the way we kind of look at it is you've got to separate AI into kind of almost two different buckets. So it's that first bit is that kind of product evidence, and that's your AI algorithm. So that's the kind of testing phase, research phase. Does this actually work in different populations? Does it work in different scenarios, and how that's being worked? And then looking at the solution evidence as, the AI as a product in itself. How does this work in practice? Because actually the whole kind of research algorithm side is very, very different to how this actually plays out in reality. Right from the start of like building an algorithm, you've got to make sure you're working with a multidisciplinary team. What are you comparing this to from an evidence perspective? This, we all talk about tech and AI, but actually, is it any better than the incumbent system? What's your comparator? What are the outcomes going to be? Who's using it? How are you then deploying this? What's the adoption looking like? What outcomes are you intending to gather? Again, looking back at the whole kind of unintended consequences and bias, but also very much that economic evidence as well. So, I mean, that goes with a lot of all solutions, not just kind of AI, but I think the main difference is that it's a kind of algorithm evidence, and then the product evidence, the kind of solution evidence that you've got there. And you've got to make sure that you've got enough for both.
The algorithm evidence one is quite interesting because you hear a lot about some of the black boxes that these large language models are coming out of, that sometimes even the designers aren't even sure exactly how these things are going to come together, and also how much that the training data really dictates what statistical weights it's going to put on the next word that it's predicting. And if you're teaching it to look for horses and a zebra comes along, is it going to statistically predict a horse or a zebra? If you can't interrogate that model, then you don't know that, it missed a zebra, you just get surfaced another horse. And so, I'm always quite curious about how that kind of scrutiny plays out realistically, because I think they are so sophisticated now and so close to being very versatile, but still the hallucinations and still some of the novel things that will just completely throw them into doing peculiar behaviors. Do you sort of see this just getting narrower and narrower, those kinds of issues, as the training gets better and better, or are we starting to hit a limit in that we've consumed so much data, so much energy actually to power these types of models, that we start to perhaps even plateau?
I think it's just going to get better and better, to be honest. So I think one of the huge issues with anything in terms of AI in healthcare is the data that you can access and how high quality it is. So if we look at different health systems, the kind of backbone of any AI is the quality of the input that you're going to have access to. And at the moment, we have so many data points, billions of data points, trillions, however many. But actually, in healthcare, I mean, we're religious about collecting data. We're very good at it. But actually, how good quality is that data? We need to make sure it's clean, curated, it's in a usable format, it's accessible to innovators, to researchers in a way that's kind of ethical, is regulated, etc. But actually, we've still not cracked that fully, because actually access to data is one of the most difficult things. Access to really good data is even harder. And you've got to invest, from any kind of government perspective, or, if you are a huge multinational company, you can get access to better data, or you can certainly clean and curate it better. But if you are an innovator who's raising funds for their startup, it's much, much more difficult. And you're relying on government data sources or national healthcare data, but it needs to be in that brilliant format. So I think this is where, we see that there's huge progress being made. There'll be more access to data, to better data, and that's just going to inform a much, much improved product at the end of the day. So I think huge improvements there that will only lead to better things. But we're now looking at large language models and things, and the amount of rubbish that potentially is input into that, to the kind of outputs that you're getting. But as soon as that, again, that will evolve over time, and see what the output is.
Yeah, I mean, these models, they're scraping everything on the internet, and some people are writing all sorts of things, in Reddit and other things, and they're surfacing them. So, as you say, that data set is so vital. The other comment to make around the kind of clinician input piece is that, as clinicians, we aren't really trained, we aren't often that restricted, we aren't often that respectful for the data that we're inputting in. And so there is something in that space too that we should be contributing to that input, to be able to generate higher quality data for our patients and for the systems that utilize them. I guess there's a comment there about the kind of infrastructure that could be supporting this, and whether things like, a data commons, or, research as a service, or some sort of additional layer of support for these startups to actually level some of the playing field. Because I could imagine, some of the bigger companies which have a lot more money and research support could be diving into this important topic quite a lot more easily, whereas someone else just starting out might be a challenge. What's your sort of take on how that ecosystem matures? What are the opportunities there?
Yeah, hugely. So another piece of work we've been doing at Imperial is how you can get fair value back for. So this is more from a kind of government perspective, how you can get fair value back for NHS data, but then very much looking at it from that innovator's perspective as well, how you can better access it. So things like secure data environments where actually you can get access, and you pay dependent on, whether you're a multinational or whether you're an innovator starting up, but having access to data that would not leave that secure data environment. So actually that's one of the biggest fears, isn't it, for both if you are the data controller, but also more out for patients in the public. It's always this fear of, like, they're taking my data, which is an absolutely legitimate, fear to have, because, there's been so many different horror stories out there. So actually having access to data in this kind of environment is a huge step forward. And you see some of the kind of early innovators in that. Mayo Clinic have got their secure data environment, but also some of the healthcare systems in Israel. They've kind of been the pioneers in that innovators come to them, use it in this secure data environment area. They can then test various algorithms, use that data, but the data never leaves that secure space, which I think is a really big step forward. And it will kind of make that inherent fear of kind of working in this space will be decreased, and actually better access for innovators who don't have the kind of, millions behind them to be able to access data. So I think it will be a huge improvement.
I wanted to now move on to a couple of bits that we've commented on throughout this conversation about economic evidence generation. I wondered, what does that look like for early innovators to start thinking about that value story, and how they actually can get their head around that part early, so that when they're ready to go to market, that these sorts of pieces of evidence are ready.
We are struggling. Like, if you look at any other bits of evidence for that digital healthcare ecosystem, we're much further behind in the game, but economic evidence is even more so. So even kind of looking at literature for different digital health tools, the amount of tools are out in the market without any real economic evidence. is really quite low. But again, it comes back to the fact, how do you actually do this? How do you model anything? Who do you work with? How are you able to work any of this out? So I think it's knowing how to do it. And actually, in this health tech space, we've not really cracked that either. So who do you work with? Economists, with somewhere like Prova Health, etc. How do you work this out? But it's such an important piece of evidence. So, working in this field, if you're an innovator, one of the first questions you're going to be asked by a VC, hopefully your tool works, and that's that kind of expectation when you go there. But actually, show me your early economic modelling. How are you going to sell this? How are you going to make sure that we're going to get the return as a VC? And actually, looking at VCs, looking at peers. So if you're a provider, and you're wanting to purchase something, show me that your product is going to give me value for money. Otherwise, there's no chance they're going to take it on board, because everyone is constrained. If you look at any funding in healthcare at the moment, whether, we saw the huge boom through COVID, there was lots of ridiculous money in this ecosystem that quickly crashed. So there's no money there. There's no money in healthcare systems. There's lack of money anywhere. So if you're not able to show that your product gives people value for money at the end of the day, then actually you're going to struggle to get that reimbursed. You're going to have any struggles to get it adopted. And it's that all across the board. So I think it's a really, it's a huge piece of evidence that is missing, I think, for most.
Now, as a founder of two companies yourself, I wondered what lessons have you learned moving from, as a respiratory physician, moving into academia, and now these two companies? What are the kind of lessons that perhaps if people who are also clinicians moving into that space could learn?
Lots of different things, I would say. So across the board is, I kind of fell into it, as opposed to, it wasn't one day that I decided I'm going to be working in health tech as an innovator. So it was, always had that interest in digital health, did a Hartness Fellowship and looked at digital health in the US, came back, and the work kind of started at Imperial. And at that point, set up the mental health company. So it was online therapy for mental health. That was a definite stab in the dark, that one. So the learning curve was very, very steep. So all of these things I talk about, economic evidence, going to do a funding round and having a VC asking any questions about financials, it was literally one of the most embarrassing moments of my life when they turned around and said, don't give up your day job.
Brutal.
So humiliation is a great lesson. And then very quickly ramped up her game and learned all of these things that actually, as a doctor, you have no idea, or certainly I had no idea about much from the business end, but you very quickly learn to talk the language and immerse yourself in that kind of ecosystem, meeting lots of different people, asking for advice. So actually, that was probably one of the biggest things, was the kind of finding that network of people, and very lucky to be supported by so many really interesting, cool, generous people with their time, who've kind of been through that journey themselves. So asking really dumb questions, but then actually, how would you do X? How would you employ this person? How would you do this thing? Or, looking at pitches for VCs, etc. Who would you go to? So I think that was probably the kind of best things, like meeting all these different people, really supportive people, really kind people, but also someone to tell you, actually, that is really terrible, don't do that. And then the second company is very lucky to start with some great co-founders, certainly learning my lessons from previous journey, but also the kind of great background that they bring, and also the complementary skills as well. It's been a very different journey in terms of setting up a business that's been growing. So yeah, two very, very different experiences, but it's good fun. It can be quite crazy at times. You always kind of look back with fondness. But
Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of different topics today, and it's been a lot of fun. My last sort of question is would you recommend any, I don't know, books or courses or any sort of spaces to kind of learn more about some of the topics that you've covered. At Prova Health, you've got some great white papers, which were super informative to me, which I'll link. But any other sort of pieces or books or things that kind of inspired you on this journey?
Oh, one of the books that I read that was really good was like Be Smarter Than Your VC. Certainly from that funding perspective, it's very, very good. That was one as a rapid, learning terminology. Now that you've asked me, any names will escape me in terms of like various podcasts and things as to how to set up your pitch or, how to run like various things like that. But it depends on like what you're looking for at that point in time. Because all of the space is like so quickly evolving, it's always very helpful to read, and certainly what other people are doing as well, because actually there's so many cool things that are happening and trying to stay up to date is almost near impossible.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sarah. It's been a really great pleasure to talk through all of these amazing topics, and I look forward to seeing what you get into next.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
And that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you want to go deeper about any of these topics or join in on the discussion, visit our website clinicalchangemakers.com or our YouTube channel. Finally, if you enjoyed our work, please give us a rating and share your favourite episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, take care.